time. I'm going to take my time now, and I'll be glad to talk to them. Let me add, first of all, that what the gentleman from North Carolina was pointing out is that there was a substantial exemption from being examined by the CFPA, not from being examined, but there is no exemption from the rule-writing capacity or the case-by-case enforcement. There were three aspects of the CFPA. Rule-writing, case-by-case enforcement, they violated my rights in this case, and then the examination and enforcement. I guess enforcement, in fairness, is a little, it has two effects here. There can be enforcement because in the annual examination you're found not to have done your job. It is that latter part that for banks that are, it is true 98% of the banks, but it's only the 1.4% of the banks that would remain fully under the CFPA have 77% of the assets and 74% of the deposits. And we have found that there were more of the problems in the larger banks. So that was the answer, that some of it will stay totally with the CFPA. And to answer the gentleman's question, yes, we could do it the other way. That's the substitute offered by the gentleman from Illinois. I'll yield to the gentleman.
Thank you.
Let me yield to the gentleman from North Carolina.
And I really appreciate, I'm trying to understand this. Why simply, if it's 98% of the institutions, why simply not take that power away from the CFPA, use the current examiners within...
Well, I'll be glad to answer, because we don't take it entirely away from the CFPA. By the way, there is a cross-delegation power here. It may well be that the CFPA would decide, and this is a point that the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hinojosa, had raised, you may have a regional bank that's above the $10 billion, that's had a very good record, and the CFPA might very well, under authority granted here, and I would encourage them to think about this, say, you know what, this bank has not been any kind of a consumer issue, and let's just leave that entirely with the regulator, and that's something we will be exploring further. The gentleman from Texas had brought that up. But the CFPA will continue to do rule writing, and it will continue to do the case-by-case enforcement, and it will have a member of the team. So when we met with community banks, look, obviously, most people I have met don't want to be regulated by anybody. Once we get beyond that, then the question is, who does regulate you and how? And when we talk to many of the community banks and credit unions, and this increases it, by the way, I know there was some question about comparability. There is comparability in this sense. The figures that we are using, 1.4% of the banks would be covered and 1.1% of the credit unions. In both cases, a much higher percentage of the assets. So that's where we get some comparability there. But what we talked to them and they said, look, I've said to many of the community banks and credit unions, you know, you don't issue credit cards. You don't do a lot of the things that got people in trouble. You didn't do subprime mortgages. You will very likely have no effect. There will be no effect on you. There may be some overdraft issues, which are important for some of the banks, but those are probably the only ones. And their answer to us was, yes, but examinations are a problem. When we're smaller institutions, we don't have the level of personnel to deal with multiple examinations. It becomes a diversion from doing our job. So we talked about ways to accommodate their concern that they would be diverted from examinations. It's also the case that when you talk about safety and soundness, so the same examiners for most of the banks and credit unions would be looking at safety and soundness and the consumer operation, but we would have a representative from the consumer agency on the team. Now, interestingly, I suppose, the representatives from the consumer agency who will be on the bank examination team will probably be, in many cases, the same people who would have been there a year ago, because we're transferring the personnel so as not to displace people or lose people, but they'll be reporting to a different agency. And the other issue is this: if the consumer agency representative on the examination team disagrees and thinks that the safety and soundness regulator was too soft on them in consumer affairs, that regulator doesn't talk to the bank. The bank was worrying about, well, I get this one talking to me and that one talking to me. The consumer agency representative would communicate to his or her agency, and that it would then go agency head to discuss this, so the bank doesn't get caught in the middle. It would have to be resolved there before it could go forward. So that's the way the scheme is intended to work. And as I said, this is an amendment that is aimed at dealing with and I understand people would rather not be regulated at all, but this was the major substantive specific complaint we got from these institutions. Is there further debate on the amendment?